minds as we begin our worship together.
I quilt. I think. I feel. I remember. There have been changes, losses, disappointments in my life. I need to stop and notice, so I quilt. Careful stitches, strong knots, back and forth. I quilt. I think. I feel. I remember.
And there are so many blessings, life itself, good friends, satisfying work, loving family, strong knots, careful stitches, back and forth, I quilt.
Welcome to everyone today. I just want to introduce ourselves up here. I'm Cherry Bennett, and this is Kitty Craig-Comin from the Worship Arts Committee, and we will be your worship leaders this morning. Thank you so much for coming and being surrounded by these wonderful quilts. It's just, we're so excited today. Would you please join with us in our opening hymn, number 22, Dear Weaver of Our Lives' Designs.
Lighting the chalice this morning is Robin Heimers. We light this chalice in recognition of the light and warmth of quilts, which carry messages of hope and survival and connection. Truth, the warmth of community, and the fire of commitment, we gather this day. May the flame we now kindle be to us a symbol of the holiness we seek. This is a sacred time to briefly share a personal joy, concern, or sorrow. Now please join in the call to meditation in singing Spirit of Life, number 123.
Please join us in silent meditation. Or not so silent meditation. Practice our Buddhist Zen breathing right here. Today is a day of celebration. May Day is coming, and with it a time of lightness of heart, fertility, and renewal. Is a perfect time to enjoy the work of our hands with knitting needles and sewing machines, garden trowels and rakes, skill saws and screwdrivers, violins, fountain pens, and walking sticks. But today is also a day of mourning. It's a day to remember the genocide of Darfur and to work toward bringing it to an end. It is the day to honor the victims of Virginia Tech and the continuing war in Iraq. It is also the day we carry our own burdens of pain and loss and concern for our friends and family. The pieces of our lives are like a crazy quilt. None of the fabrics seem to go together. As we stitch each square, some pieces clash and complain. And yet, as we assemble the whole quilt, a pattern emerges. Looking closely, we could see the pain or joy of each piece, but stepping back, we see the way each piece has combined to create the spiritual story of our lives. Today, may each of us remember the power of our hands in creativity, in love, and in following our own path of spirit. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen.
Words of Wisdom from Aunt Jane of Kentucky, written by Eliza Calvert Hall 100 years ago in 1907. Did you ever think, child, she said presently, how much piecing a quilt is like living a life? And as for sermons, why, there's no better sermon to me than a patchwork quilt, and the doctrines are right there, a lot plainer than they are in the catechism. You see, you start out with just so much calico. You don't go to the store and pick it out and buy it, but the neighbors give you a piece here and a piece there, and you'll have a piece every time you cut a dress, and you take just what happens to come. And that's like predestination. But when it comes to the cutting out, why, you're free to choose your own pattern. You can give the same kind of pieces to two persons, and one will make a 9-patch quilt, and one will make a wild goose chase. And there will be 2 quilts made out of the same kind of pieces, and just as different as they can be. And that's just the way it is with the living. The Lord sends us the pieces, but we can cut them out and put them together pretty much to suit ourselves. And there's a heap more in the cutting out and the sewing than there is in the calico.
This reading is from the concluding chapter in the Margaret Ikas book, The Standard Book of Quilt Making and Collecting, first published in 1949. What's in a quilt? Then, with the completed quilt on the refinished antique 4-poster, she can run her fingers over the glowing, smooth stitched surface and remember the past, as did one great-grandmother back in Ohio. That kindly ancient lady reminisced as she passed her work-worn fingers over a quilt she had pieced together while her family was growing up. It took me more than 20 years, nearly 25, I reckon, she told me softly. in the evenings after supper when the children were all put to bed. My whole life is in that quilt. It scares me sometimes when I look at it. All my joys and all my sorrows are stitched into those little pieces. When I was proud of the boys and when I was downright provoked and angry with them. When the girls annoyed me or when they gave me a warm feeling around my heart. And John, too. He was stitched into that quilt all the 30 years we were married. Sometimes I loved him, and sometimes I sat there hating him as I pieced those patches together. So they are all in that quilt. My hopes and fears, my joys and sorrows, my loves and hates. I tremble sometimes when I remember what that quilt knows about me.
As I prepared for this worship service, it was a surprise to me to realize I've given away all the quilts that I completed myself. I made a block for the peace ribbon, a banner composed of quilted panels to wrap around the Pentagon. I think that was in 1985. I did a scene of the Hoosic Mountains. I lived out in the Berkshires then. I did a scene of the Hoosic Mountain and Mount Greylock suggested in the background to illustrate things we would lose if there were a nuclear war. My favorite quilt is the one my daughter Laura and I made for her dolls. Or I should say stuffed animals. She's never been into dolls. But when she was in the 2nd grade, we made this together, and it's hanging on the podium here. There is a religious education curriculum called ABC Quilts, in which children learn about quilting, learn about AIDS at an appropriate level, and make quilts for children who have AIDS. We made 4 very interesting quilts for the ABC Quilts program one year at the UU congregation in Andover. And it was a learning experience for everybody, with the mothers learning how to let go of some of the colors and patterns they might have liked to see, but they were wonderful, wild, fun quilts. Laura and I were in a UU mother-daughter group for several years, and I led a few sessions in which each mother-daughter pair pieced a block with the flaming chalice symbol in different fabrics. The top was pieced, the layers basted together, and a little quilting done when we went on to other activities. Last year, Mary, one of the mothers in the group, developed a fatal progressive neurological disease. I decided to finish quilting the piece and gave it to Mary prior to her death. We found we could not remember which blocks had been pieced by which mother-daughter pair. I then recalled that all of the flames had been cut from the same fabric, but Mary and Rosita had lost theirs and had used a different yellow fabric to complete their block. So then we knew which one was theirs. When asked, Rosita said she would like to have 2 interlocking hearts as the quilted pattern. At the time the quilt was given to them, Mary opened her eyes widely and looked at the quilt and had a startled sort of reaction, visibly moved by seeing it. Her husband was amazed at her reaction and spoke of her expressive eyes. Her daughter is pleased to have it to remember our fun times together, and I'm grateful to her for lending it to us this morning. There is a group called MGH Comforters. So I'm a social worker at Mass General. And these people piece together, thank you, Wendy, piece together tops of quilts individually and then meet monthly to finish them with tied knots. These quilts are given to pediatric patients who are too ill to provide, to be able to be active and physically playing. I was on call one night when a child was dying, and I was present when one of these quilts was given to her mother. It was made of a beautiful, bright red floral fabric, and it just brightened the whole room as her mother spread it over her and tucked her in. The quilt went home with the family after she died, a lovely remembrance of the personal care provided, and something to comfort them in the days ahead. I love quilts. I love the beauty and variety of colors and patterns. I'm intrigued with historical meaning of the patterns. I'm impressed by the skill in design, cutting, and sewing. I feel a deep sense of well-being when I am looking at quilts. I love the chatting and the laughter, the collaboration and sense of community so frequently a part of quilting. I enjoy the solitary, meditative act of quilting. It's a true form of mindfulness for me. For me, this is a spiritual activity which combines appreciation of individual creativity and expression, compassion and nurturing of others, support of social action causes, and also provides an interconnected web, which is visual, tactile, and symbolic.
We will now take our offering.
I'm sorry. I had just wanted to mention as the introduction to the offertory that green is the theme for the offertory, but it is also the theme for the green quilt that we have up there. It's the Irish chain, and that's the quilt for the raffle this year. As you can see, the top has been pieced, and we will be sending it to be quilted soon. But thank you to Susanne Sullivan, Lynne Champion, and Wendy Kinsler for this work.
Our offertory anthem today is AIDS by Captain Fair. This song is written to commemorate the AIDS quilt. Each square of that quilt was created by a family or a friend in honor of someone who has died of AIDS.
And I know that my name could be there, and I feel Good morning. I grew up sleeping under hand-stitched quilts. I didn't give it any thought as a child. My house was full of them. They were used as blankets on every bed in the house. They were all real bright and pretty, thousands of different patterns and fabrics. You could spend a long time looking at them, enjoying the different repeating patterns. The quilts were all made by my mother's mother, who was a shadowy grandmother, who was a very, very old lady by the time my sister and I were born. She lived out in Oregon on the West Coast, and I only met her twice in my whole life, once when I was 2 years old, and again when I was 5, shortly before she died. I know my grandmother primarily from those very few hazy memories and from photographs that my mother had and from her quilts. I learned as I grew up that my mother had been raised on an isolated farm in Oregon. By the time my mother came along, she was a late-in-life baby. Her older brother and her sisters were all grown up, most of them married already. My mother grew up wearing homemade clothes, eating homemade bread, occupying herself with homemade amusements because the farm did not have electricity or any kind of modern conveniences. And my mother could not wait to get off that farm and to get into town where all the fun was. My mother got married in 1946 to a soldier just home from the war. The wedding was held on her parents' 46th wedding anniversary. They had a joint celebration together. I've seen some old photographs of it. And right after the wedding, the young couple moved here to the East Coast, and my mother never looked back. From then on, she wanted store-bought. She liked store-bought clothes. She wanted store-bought food. She wanted store-bought everything. And I will tell you that when I came along, she was astounded to discover that I really had a fondness for her mother's way of life. Now, I know that that's the general way of things. Each generation wants to be a little different from the one that came before. But I really did have a strong affinity for the way that my grandmother grew up. I couldn't wait to learn how to cook, to bake bread, to sew my own clothes. By the time I was a teenager, I was teaching myself to piece simple quilt blocks. The image of my grandmother sitting on her farm, stitching away at all those quilts, always stayed with me. It was a very pretty, very nostalgic sort of an idea to me, and I just loved it. Now, I did know that my grandmother quilted out of necessity. I was told that she never owned a store-bought bed covering until her 50th wedding anniversary. If they wanted covers for the beds in a house with no central heating, she had to make them. Quilting, I know, in those days, was something that was considered an acceptable way to use up what little free time you had. It was more acceptable than socializing or reading. Those were frivolous things. But I also know that my grandmother would never have made the hundreds of quilts that she did if it was just a duty to her. I'm quite sure that she did it because it gave her satisfaction. It was something that possibly drew some compliments from the community. I know that my mother tells me that her parents were very, very serious people. They didn't argue, they didn't fight, and they didn't laugh much either. When her mother was angry or troubled, she retreated to her quilting, and she worked it out that way. And when she had something to celebrate, she did that in quilts, too. In fact, this pink and green quilt hanging over here was made to celebrate my parents' wedding. It's a very traditional 1930s kind of a quilt in bright, cheery colors, so that was how my grandmother showed the joy in her life. My grandmother did quilt all through the 1920s and 30s and beyond, during the time of our country's first big quilting revival. I learned through my history books that during the Depression years, there was a great wave of nostalgia for the good old days, the pioneer days that they all thought was much better than what they were going through then. The local farm newspapers and farm journals all carried quilting patterns during those years. And apparently, women just took up quilting like crazy. It was a cheap way to add something colorful and attractive to your house. It was something that you could enjoy that didn't cost you much money. I do believe that my grandmother quilted because she loved it. Now, you already heard one quote this morning from this Aunt Jane of Kentucky. That's a fictional character who was much quoted during the 30s and 40s and beyond. I don't know how much you feel about her use of quilting metaphors to explain predestination and free will, But I do think that the lady was spot on in her description of why it is that a housewife might want to take up some homely, old-fashioned thing like quilting. And it was really old-fashioned even in the 30s. Here's one more quote from this Aunt Jane book. "I have been a hard worker all my life," she said, setting herself and folding her hands restfully. "But most all of my work has been of the kind that perishes with the using, as the Bible says." That's the discouraging thing about a woman's work. Millie Amos used to say that if a woman was to see all the dishes that she had to wash before she died piled up in front of her in one big pile, she'd lie down and die right there. Now, I have always had the name of a good housekeeper, but when I am dead and gone, there ain't anybody going to think of the floors I've swept and the tables I've scrubbed and the old clothes I've patched and the stockings I've darned. But when one of my grandchildren or great-grandchildren sees one of my quilts, they'll think about Aunt Jane, and wherever I am then, I'll know that I ain't forgotten. Now, that's a sentiment that I've heard many times in my lifetime from the women that I've quilted with. Now, I've been quilting all through the second great quilting revival in this country. There was another big upsurge in interest in it in the 1970s, about the time of our bicentennial. Now, in my generation, nobody quilts because they need to. In fact, we can buy anything we want, and it's not worth the time and the effort it takes to make something handmade. You can get it cheaper in a store. So we quilt for other reasons altogether. And when the topic of quilting came up for a church service, in fact, it came up while some of us were gathered together working on the green stole that we gave to the minister last Sunday, the general response was, "Oh, well, we like quilts, it's interesting and all, but what in the world is spiritual about it?" So folks, here it is. Here's the message. Now, to my mind, quilting is just one of a variety of different paths to spiritual wholeness, a path that depends on the work of our hands to give meaning and direction to our lives. The words that follow could be said about most quilters that I know, but they could also be said for a lot of gardeners, for woodworkers, for craftsmen, for artists, for ordinary working folks of all kinds. I would expect that the members of our choir would say that it's their music that gives meaning to their lives, and in their case it's their voices rather than their hands that opens the way for them. But the principle is still the same. Quilting for me is a slow, meditative, often solitary undertaking. It requires that I work with care and precision. It occupies my hands. It gives me time to think. It doesn't require any particular talent beyond the willingness to practice a skill, and it produces something that's useful in the world, so I don't feel I have to apologize for the time I spend on it. And yet, it has the ability to create the occasional transcendent moment in my life. Now, for example, John and I were married for many, many years before we finally managed to have children. And neither of our fathers lived to see any of the babies. And I grieved for a long time that neither of these two good-hearted men ever lived to see them. And I worked through my difficulties over that by working on a pair of grandfather's quilts for our twin sons. Now, one of them is on display over there. It's mostly gold. The two quilts were assembled in large part from neckties that were worn by these two grandfathers. The quilts and the train blocks are the blocks are assembled in the train rows from the quilts that were worn by my husband's father, who was a train man, and the ones in the rows that feature a little quilted fire truck were from my dad, who was a lifelong spark, and volunteer firefighter all of his life. Now, in the years that the children were small, when I was chronically sleep-deprived, quilting was my drug of choice. It was very calming. It was almost soporific in its nice, easy monotony. I could take it with me to yards and playgrounds. Later on, it filled up an awful lot of otherwise useless hours sitting in carpools and in various waiting rooms. I didn't get a lot of work done then, but I had a good time with every stitch. And later, when I could actually get out nights and be with other women, I relished the founding of our Town of Reading's local quilting guild. and I made friendships there. And then I began to be able to take part in group quilting, charity projects, Quilts for a Good Cause. In recent years, I've made some lap robes that were made especially to cheer up patients in nursing homes. I helped to make some bed-sized quilts that were distributed by Reading's Mission of Deeds to families who have lost their homes. One year we made very tiny little quilts to cover incubators at a neonatal intensive care department in the New England Medical Center in Boston. Those were made to go over the incubators of little babies, and we knew that some of the quilts would go home with babies and some of them might get buried with babies. I made one little quilt for that project, and while I was working on it, I decided that I would make it all different shades of black and gray and white, and up in one corner with this one bright little burst of bright yellow. And then I quilted some words around the outside edge of it. The words that I quilted were, "A quilt for the human condition, darkness and light, joy and sorrow, and sunshine in unexpected places." Now, I was told later that that quilt was hung in a waiting room at the hospital. That's lovely. I've never seen it. I haven't been there. But I do know that I got a whole lot more good out of making that quilt than anybody sitting in one of those waiting rooms would get from looking at it. Now, in the last 10 or 12 years, I have been very fortunate to work with other people here at this church on an annual raffle quilt. I made some good friends. It's kind of cemented my place here in the church. It's given me a real role that I'm comfortable with. We have a spiral-bound notebook on display down there that has photographs and little samples of all of the quilts that we worked on that we can remember. And I hope you'll come up and take a look. Maybe you'll remember some of them. Of the quilts that we worked on, the ones I liked the best were the ones that a lot of different people had a hand in. For example, one was a basket quilt, where Wendy and Lynne and I stitched together stylized little baskets, and then we handed them out to people in the congregation and said, fill these baskets with something that you can sew in place. And we ended up with baskets of flowers and baskets of vegetables and fruit. We had a basket of puppies from one person, a basket of wrapped up presents, a basket of teddy bears. The one that I liked the best was made by Kim Reef. She put a flame in the middle of hers, and it turned into a flaming chalice. So we stuck that one right in the middle of that raffle quilt. But the one closest to my heart was the one that we did last year. We worked on it during the year that Laurel Klug was back in treatment for her breast cancer, which had come back. For that quilt, we made 48 different blocks. Each one had a stylized stem and 2 leaves, and we handed out these 48 blocks, and we said, make us a flower. Any kind of a flower you want. We'll offer you a pattern if you want, or you just cook one up your own self. And we had 32 different people in this church who contributed to that one. 2 blocks were made by children. 2 were made by men. I thought, hooray. Several were made by people who had never stitched anything in their lives. One tried to glue the pieces on, but we did explain that they had to be sewn down. Many of them were made by very experienced quilters. Laurel herself made 2 blocks for that quilt, and she did die before it was finished. I think it's the most beautiful quilt we ever made. I think it was a real example of fellowship to be working on it. Our group of quilters here has also made a couple of comfort quilts that are designed to be sent out to people who are ill or in trouble. They're loaned out temporarily, and then they come back when the trouble has been resolved. We haven't made one for several years now, and it is my very fond wish that this spring we'll start work on another one. And if we were to set up a table in Community Hall and offer up pieces of fabric and fabric markers, we hope that many of you will come and write your name on a piece and write your good wishes, and we'll stitch that into another comfort quilt. Quilting is a plain, old-fashioned handicraft. It's one of the ways in which I find my place in the world. It's the way that I comfort and reward myself. It's the way I make peace with the troubles that I can't resolve. Quilting has its social and useful moments, but the quilting itself is more of an act of meditation or even a prayer for me. There were times in my life when I genuinely thought I'd be in a mental institution if I didn't have my quilts. Raising 4 kids in 4 years will do that to some folks. I know that there are people who turn quilting into an art. There are fabulous quilts in museums now that are worth thousands and thousands of dollars. And there are people who use quilting for real social issues. The Names Project to memorialize the people who have died of AIDS is one example. I understand now that of the 50,000 panels made, if you laid them all out together, they would cover multiple football fields. That really moves me. The quilting that I do doesn't compare in any way to that sort of thing, but it gives me peace, and it centers me in the world. And without question, quilting is the most spiritual thing that I do.
Wow. I'm just so impressed. I want to thank Susanne for sharing her love of quilting and her wisdom with us, and also to Lynne and Anne and Kitty for their readings. They're all quilters. And I know many of you are out there or do other kind of handiwork, so we want to also recognize those as well. After the service is over, if you could take some time and just take a look at the different quilts that are around. Most of them have a little note explaining something about the story of the quilt. And they're pretty fascinating. Some are made by members of the congregation, some were handed down. There are other stories as well, and they're gorgeous. So I didn't make any of them, so I'm allowed to say that. They're amazing! So, but today you've heard a lot of other people reflect on their experience with quilts, and we want to invite you folks to share some of your experiences either with a quilt, either quilting or a quilt. You don't have to have been the one who made it, or other kinds of handiwork, something that has touched you in your life that was made by someone's hand. So if you would share a sentence or two about that, we'd love to hear your stories now too. Looks like Kitty and Rob are going to come around with microphones. If you have, it can be something short or...
I often start things and don't finish them, but this year I completed 2 quilts for babies. One was for my great-nephew, who is healthy and alive, and the other was for a child who was stillborn. Both parents have asked me for advice, and it's sort of strange. It's like a transition into being an older generation. Thank you.
Hi, I didn't realize how many things would come to mind when thinking about quilting, but just like that, I thought of 3. One, I was the recipient of the use of the comfort quilt a number of years ago, and it was wonderful. Second, it made me think back to the Underground Railroad and how sometimes quilts were hung out as symbols. And there was a third thing, if I could remember what it was. When we went to Amish country, I remember walking into a place where a group of women were quilting, and I was just so envious of the camaraderie and the joy that went into their creating of their quilts. So I just wanted to say those things.
My mother and grandmother were both quilters, so I have a number of them in my house. 2 particular ones caused me great reflection. One was done by my grandmother, Durrell, who was a Midwestern farmer. And I took it up to be documented to the Lowell Quilt Museum. What I took was a red and brown oak leaf patterned quilt to the Quilt Museum. The women there donned their white gloves and put on their thinking caps, and they're just tremendously knowledgeable women up there. And they touched it all and they said, this wasn't originally a brown and red quilt. This was a red and green oak leafed quilt, because the fabric from that time period, the green fabric, we know faded into brown. So over time, she started with a red and green quilt that she passed on, and it's become something quite different in my house, and it just makes me think. The second little story is my mother died having just pieced a wall hanging. It is a beautiful wall hanging, and she quilted with a bunch of ladies, just the way in the old times one might have. And every week she went off with her quilting group, and her quilting group took the wall hanging that she had pieced and did how many gazillion little tiny quilting stitches to finish it after she had died. But they put her name on the back because they said the one who did the piecing should be the one whose name was on the back. So I took this wonderful effort of friendship from her quilting group and hung it in the nursing home where my dad was for 8 years. And so there was a piece of my mother and a piece of the friends surrounding him for that time period. You first, Jen? Okay. I'm Elaine Olson, and quilts have played a big role in our family, not thanks to my sister or I, who are probably cutting with the tradition just because we haven't had the time or the skill. But both my grandmothers, my mother, all of her sisters, everybody in the family made these quilts as well as their friends. And I think it's a nice tradition. They're not only meaningful to me, but my two boys have quilts that were made for them by family members from the time they were babies, and they are still on their beds today. And even though they're ragged, they will not let me get rid of any of them because of the sentiment. And I brought one quilt today that has a story. It's the yellow one on the pew, the far pew. All of my parents, friends, and family made them two quilts, one for my mother and one for my father on their 50th wedding anniversary. And my parents are no longer with us, but they are through the quilts. My sister has one of them, and I have that one that's on the pew.
Jack Goldberg again. In my other lifetime, long time ago when I was in the Army, we were in Italy. And it was a cold spring day and chilly, and where the damp gets in your bones. And we wanted to get in out of the rain, and there was a farmhouse there. So we liberated the farmhouse, no people, no electricity, and walked in, and I could not get warm. And the guys just took their shoes off, put their field jackets over themselves, and laid on the floor or on benches or wherever. And I said, no, it's got to be better than this. I went upstairs, the bedroom. There was a huge bed with a crucifix up over the head, about 3 by 2 anyways. And I said, and I looked down, and it was a bright red sateen-covered quilt. Sure, it was machine made. I doubt very much it was. And I took off just my shoes and crawled into bed and pulled this thick cover up over me and fell sound asleep. About 3 days later, Italy surrendered, and I always remember that red quilt and what it brought to mind.
On Christmas Eve this past year, not having a gift for my mother, as everyone knew she was, suffering from cancer, and I didn't know what to get her. Roald and I decided we were going to make her a quilt for Christmas, and we went to the fabric store and bought all the fabric on the morning of Christmas Eve. And so I started a quilt the morning of Christmas Eve. I worked on that quilt every moment, and 7 days later, on New Year's Eve day, I brought that finished quilt. It was a lover's knot quilt in bright purple to her house and gave it to her. It was not quilted, it was only knot tied. That was the very first thing she asked for yesterday when she went to rehab, was to have that quilt back on her bed in rehab. So it will be going to rehab this afternoon with me to go on her bed.
I don't know if you know that one of the comfort quilts went to London. When Joyce was taken ill in London and was hospitalized over there, somebody in the congregation or attached to the congregation or a friend of someone in the congregation, something, was going to London, and so they handed that person the quilt and suddenly delivered it to me over there. And I put it on Joyce's bed for a little bit with her own signed square somewhere near her face. And then a few days later, partly because she was unconscious and partly so it wouldn't be lost in the hospital, I took it home and I put it on me while I was sleeping in the cold English houses that my son has, typical. And somehow got it back again. But those comfort quilts are pretty cool, and they get around.
Over 20 years ago, I used to make my own clothes. I made my suits, I made my husband's shirts, and I had a foot treadle Singer sewing machine, so it's over 100 years old now. And I loved sewing on that. It was very peaceful. I could use it while my husband was watching TV, because as people who have the electric sewing machines know, a lot of times it messes up the television. And I used to spend hours and hours, and I couldn't wait getting up on Saturday and Sunday mornings and working on all these things that I've made. And then when I had children, I just didn't have the time, and even though I enjoyed sewing, I realized it had become a chore because I just couldn't squeeze it in. And so I haven't really made much of anything over the years, but I was so inspired by this morning's service, and I didn't really know a lot. I didn't really think a lot about quilting, and I have a lot of passion for things that I don't have time to do during this period in my life, and now I get to add quilting to the list of when I retire. I want to quilt. So thank you for everyone.
Hi, my name is Marcia Finkelstein. I'm fairly new to the congregation. I had no idea, because I haven't been here in a couple of weeks, what the theme was. And when you ask people to get up and speak, I recalled a year ago, I run a teen pregnancy prevention program that involves service learning in Salem. And when we started our program, one of the schools that we work with was doing a theme around HIV and AIDS, and the woman who facilitated it, the school nurse, worked with them on their service project, and they brought a huge panel of the AIDS quilt to the school to display. And what transpired and was just amazing. These kids who were like 14, 15, 13, whatever, they were like becoming AIDS advocates to educate their peers. And we had a wonderful community event where we had a woman whose son had died of AIDS in the community, and she brought her panel that she was going to be donating to the Names Project later that year. And so it was really inspiring for the kids and for the community. And this just all kind of came to me while I was sitting here. The students added to that by wanting to actually do a panel for someone who had died, or someone who was getting close to that. What turned out was, and what was really sweet, was there was a student in the school whose cousin had died of AIDS, who was born HIV positive, who had never gotten the care that she had could have had access to because of her poverty, and was 18 when she died. And they made a quilt for her that they were going to donate to the Names Project. So I just thought I'd share that. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ann Mark, and if you look at the windows over there, you'll see a panel for the Sewing Circle, and then toward the back, one for Emily Ruggles. The Sewing Circle was the original liberal ladies group from 1840 to 1923. Through the work of their hands, they kept this church going for quite a while back in the 1800s. One of the things that they did was quilting, and they would get together once a month. They rotated from house to house, and Emily Ruggles, who was Ruth White's great aunt, at one time had a horse and carriage. And she wrote in her diary about going to the Sewing Circle meetings. She would, with her horse and buggy, pick up the quilting frame at one person's house and take it to the house of the next person who was hosting the Sewing Circle, and she would be there to set up the quilting frame. So we actually know the houses where some of these quilting parties were held, and we know that Emily faithfully, month after month, would pick up those quilting frames and take them to the next house. So there is, this is actually a wonderful continuation of something that is very rooted in this congregation.
I'm Robert Craig-Comin, and I don't quilt. And I don't have a story about a quilt. What I was struck by is it was said that it's about all kinds of things we do with our hands and even our voices. And I do handiwork and I work with wood. And I was realizing, as it was mentioned about people sleeping under quilts, that Kitty and I sleep in a bedroom, and our kids slept in bedrooms that I built. They were surrounded by me in that.
Oh, those are all wonderful stories. Thank you so much for sharing today. And I know there are many stories that you're thinking about right now, but you're thinking, oh, we want to get done in time. I'm not going to share today. But it's so obvious that quilting is such a part of our community and all the handiwork we do that shares our connection with each other, our support for each other, and lets us engage in our own spiritual sides. And I just love those stories. Let's sing our closing hymn. It is called Common Thread, and Al and I are going to lead it, and you folks hopefully will pick it up and join right in.
We're going to ask you to at least sing on the chorus, and in the verses, there's a line, we will rise all together, we will rise. Please join us with that, and if you feel inspired, and we're getting tired up here, so help us with the chorus as well. With the chorus, there are two tricky bits. The third line changes every time. Watch out for that. And in the last chorus, instead of singing the word family, because it just won't fit, we'll just make it family. Then it'll fit with the music. We'll sing the chorus through twice, once together, and then you join us. We will rise like the ocean, we will rise like the sun. We will rise all together, we will rise. In our many-colored fabrics made from strands of common thread, we will rise all together, we will rise. We will rise like the ocean, we will rise like the sun. We will rise all together, we will rise. In our many-colored fabrics made from strands of common thread, we will rise all together, we will rise.
In our many-colored garden, we are growing side by side.
We will rise all together, we will rise.
With the sun and rain upon us, not a row shall be denied.
We will rise all together, we will rise. We will rise like the ocean, we will rise like the sun. We will rise all together, we will rise. No more will there be hunger. No more will there be hunger in the strands of common thread. We will rise all together, we will rise.
We can feed our grain to cattle, and the rich man will be fed.
We will rise all together, we will rise.
Or we'll feed our grain to people, so that millions will have bread.
We will rise all together, we will rise. We will rise like the ocean, we will rise like the sun. We will rise all together, we will rise. In our many-colored fabrics, in our many-colored fabrics made from strands of common thread, we will rise all together, we will rise.
In the cold of fear and hatred, clothed in dignity we stand.
We will rise all together, we will rise.
We have built this quilt together, linking hearts with stitching hands.
We will rise all together, we will rise. We will rise like the ocean, we will rise like the sun. We will rise all together, we will rise. We are spirits drawn together. We are spirits drawn together, tightly by our common thread.
will rise like the ocean. We will rise like the sun. We will rise all together. We will rise. We will build a global family. We will build a global family strengthened by our common thread. We will rise all together. We will repeat the first chorus, please. We will rise like the ocean. We will rise like the sun. We will rise all together. We will rise in our many-colored fabrics made from strands of common thread. We will rise all together. We will rise.
Quilting is the miracle of giving new life and purpose to fabric scraps. It can rejuvenate our spiritual life too. We affirm that life is here and now in our quilting and in all our handiwork to enable our journey. Leave here with hearts and hands full of creativity and joy and promise.
Extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth,
and the warmth of community,
or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts.